Saving images in different ways. Setting up your image for print. So you save it for print. That would be a high resolution 300 ppi pixels per inch image. Setting it up for screen resolution, right, which is 72 ppi. And we're looking in Bridge right now. This is a raw file. It's already been edited. I edited it mostly in Photoshop. Mostly in Adobe Camera Raw, ACR. Right? And you know that if you're looking at one of these thumbnails in Bridge, because if up in the top right-hand corner you see these two icons. In this case, I cropped the image, and I corrected the perspective in the image, and then I cropped it. But even if you hadn't cropped it, to the right you see this little circle with like sliders in there. It tells you you've done some editing, right? So you know that the image has been edited. It's still a RAW file, and my Sony camera makes a RAW file that's called ARW, which is the Sony A camera. It's an AR camera. Okay, so and if I double click on this, it's going to open up in ACR, the raw processor. And you can see some of the settings I used over on the right. It doesn't look like I changed much in terms of exposure on the right. I know I did do some like darkening in the bottom edge, and I added, depending on which one I'm in, I have different edits you can see here, and I'm getting to those by going over to snapshots, right? I ultimately, I have different vignettes, different exposure settings, and so on, right? I'm switching between them on the right side, right? Okay, let's see. Down at the very bottom, I went over this when I talked about using Bridge, or using the ACR, Adobe Camera Raw, to edit your image. And I said that the first thing you should set up is what the output is going to be. So you can see my cursor is down here at the bottom of my workspace, and it says sRGB, which is the color space for web, 72 ppi, which is the resolution for web, 1080 pixels. I've made it that large on the long side of the image. In other words, so from left to right, it will output at 1080 pixels, right? And it's an 8-bit image. Okay. If I want to change this from the very start and say, oh, I want to make this, I know I'm going to print this, so I need to be higher resolution. So I go here and I say, hey, I've made a preset that is actually print. For my printer, in my printer, I know that it wants 330 ppi, but generally speaking, for print, you output an image at 300 ppi, right? And then depending on where you're sending that image to be printed, different printers request different resolutions. I think I've had a professional printer ask for something as low as 250. I personally have printed images lower than 200 because I needed the image to be bigger. The lower the PPI, the lower the definition, the detail, the texture that will be in the image. But sometimes you make those sacrifices because you need it to be big. If you sacrifice too much and you go all the way down to 72 ppi, you'll get a pixelated print. Okay, so traditionally speaking, 300 ppi is the resolution for print. Okay, and for the sake of doing this right now, I'm going to say I'll output this at 330 ppi. This is a preset that I made for 11 by 17 inch paper. Okay, it's a landscape print. Okay, so I go like that. Okay, when I'm printing, it's an Adobe RGB. That's the color space for print in most cases, right? There is a printer that I have at one school that actually prints in sRGB because it's a cheap printer. Adobe RGB has a wider color gamut. It will show more colors than sRGB. And how do you change that? Well, you go here, right? And there are a bunch of, these are called profiles, and they're profiles for different printers, different screens, different devices of all types. But up in the very top, those are the profiles you're concerned with right here. And that's Adobe RGB for print, sRGB for screen. Pro RGB is another one. I'm going to skip it, but these are the two main ones right now. I know that there are some others here too, but we're concerned either with Adobe RGB, and technically Adobe RGB 1998, and sRGB IEC blah 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 blah. Okay, for print Adobe RGB. Okay, and I've set the resolution down here for my printer. It's an Epson 3800. It wants 330 pixels per inch. I know that because Epson told me this. And I'm printing on 11 by 17 inch paper, so I've preset this here. So it's going to scale down the image a little bit to fit on that paper. Okay. Down below it says output sharpening, and frankly I don't do anything there. I let it go. Below that it says Photoshop, open in Photoshop Smart Objects, and that can be a really good thing. It means that the image in Photoshop will retain all the original data despite your scaling the image up and down, you're transforming it one way or another, right? And it can be a good thing. In fact, I'll do that because I'm not going to do any editing in Photoshop. Okay, so I'll go there. Okay, now that's the first place you start when you're editing your image, is set it up for the output so that you can now, based on that output, you can determine, exposure, contrast, color balance, and so on. There'll be a slight difference in color balance between Adobe RGB 1998 and sRGB. Okay. So, all right, I'm going to open this image, and I'll go there. It'll take a second. Here it is. Right. Well, here it is. I already have it open up in Photoshop, but I opened it up at a different resolution for screen resolution. So I'll just let this open. I'll just take a second or two. And this version will be for print. Okay, this is the print version of the image. If I want to check its size and its resolution, I can go up to Image, Image Size, right? And the keystroke for that is Command Option I on a Mac. On a PC, it's Control Alt I. So if I click on that, I get this window that tells me the size of the image, the resolution of the image, the size of the file, right? It's 42.2 megabytes. All right. Once this gets opened and saved as a PSD file, in my case, it'll actually be over 80 megabytes, but that has to do with my camera. Okay, I can switch the units from pixels to anything I like. It's common for us in the US to be thinking in inches, despite the fact that we were supposed to switch to metric many moons ago. These other units are for layout, and they're often used for typography or layout kind of stuff. Okay, meaning like magazine layout, newspaper layout, that kind of thing. Okay, so if I switch this to inches, you'll see it's 14.2 inches wide and 9.5 inches high, and that's because I set it up to print on 11 by 17 inch paper. Okay. All right. So if I wanted to change the resolution, I could do that here. But let's just say, for right now, I'm okay with it. I just say OK. Okay. It has the original file number on it, and the original, it has the raw file format to it. Okay. Now I want to save this for print, and I'm going to save it as a PSD file. PSD files are lossless. That means they retain all the original data. Okay, so all I have to do is go Command S or Control S on a PC, and because it's a raw file, it doesn't just save it, it switches over to this window, and I have PSD Photoshop file down in the format where my cursor is hovering. Right? If I click on that, there are a bunch of other different formats. right? It could go with TIFF. Both TIFF and Photoshop are common photographic file formats, and they are both lossless. They retain all the data in the original file, right? You often see files now, photographic files, as PNGs. They are lossless also, but they're not really designed for, or they weren't anyway, designed for photographic work. They were designed for graphics. JPEG is the common photographic file format, right? It is lossy. When you choose JPEG, it compresses the file, meaning it's discarding data that the algorithm says that is redundant, repetitive, unnecessary. So it compresses the file, makes it much smaller, and which is fine for the screen, but typically for print you want to keep the data. So PSD files or Photoshop files or TIFF is the way to go. Personally, I use Photoshop, right? If you're sending this out to a professional printer, they might be working with software that doesn't recognize Photoshop file, which is Acrobat, which is Adobe. They might need this more generic thing. And there is this Photoshop RAW, right? But I don't know any reason to save it as a Photoshop RAW file because it's also lossless like Photoshop and TIFF, but there's really I don't see any advantage to that, but maybe it's worth researching it. So I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file, which is .psd, right? And when I save my files, I give it a name, like Cone's Wall, right? So that I can recognize in the name what the image is going to be, roughly, Cones and Wall, right? And if I'm going to do some editing in Photoshop, maybe I've done some more color adjustments, some exposure, maybe I've added a vignette in Photoshop, then I would call this a project file, PROJ. That's my designation, so that when I look at the name of the file, I know that that's a project file. It has layers in it that I can go back and edit. If it's just for print, like in this case, and it's for a specific size, like in this case, I would say 11 by 17, and I could add print, right, in the name. Notice I always keep this number that came from the camera. This is my choice, this is what I do, because if I want to take that PSD file and find out what the raw file is, the original file, if somehow or other they've gotten dislocated from one another, they're in different parts of my hard drive, and I want to find the raw file again, I can search by that number, in this case 4279, and hopefully find the raw file. Right? So that's an important thing, being able to keep track of the original file and all its quote-unquote children, the print file, the web file, the screen file, right? Imagine if you're working with a group of people and you might know where the raw file is, but somebody in your group needs to be able to find it too. So the way you organize your files, how you name them, has to be done by a certain convention. In my case, I can establish my own conventions, but if you're working for a company and multiple people are working with these files, there needs to be some kind of convention that everybody's working by, right? So that everyone can find the files that they need. Then give it a tag, or multiple tags. For me, this would be Brooklyn. These shots are coming from a project I call Third Ave. It's walls, right? It's urban. These kinds of things, so that now I can search for this for a group of files that have the Brooklyn tag, right, and so on. Okay. So I'll save that. It's in Photoshop. I'm not going to save layers in Photoshop, even though I really didn't add any layers anyway. So I'll leave it like this, and I'll say save. Okay. It's saving. Take a second. Okay, so that file is saved back in the folder where the raw file came from. Okay, and that's set up for print. Okay, so now I want to size this for screen. I could go back into the raw file, open it up in ACR, and reset that for screen output. Okay, but I can rescale it here if I go Command Option I, Control Alt I on a PC, and I could say, all right, I want to make this smaller. I want to make it for screen. That's 72 ppi, not 330. I have resample checked here. It means when I scale this down, the image is also, it is going to shrink, I think. I always have to do this and double check. So it actually, it's 72 ppi, but it's actually retained the inch dimensions. Right? But let's check out the pixels. Where are the pixels? Pixels now, it's 1,000 pixels, right? Basically on the long side, right? Which is big enough for screen viewing. We're going to say for web viewing. But okay, it's actually, if you wanted to have a background image on a website, you'd want it to be probably 2,000 pixels large, right? I'm not going to deal with that right now. Okay, so I've reduced the resolution down to 72 ppi, right? Up in the top it says image size. It went from 42 megabytes down to 2 megabytes, right? So just by reducing the resolution, the number of pixels per square inch, right, shrinks that file size quite a bit, right? So if you're showing something on the screen, that's all the resolution you need. Anyway, if you're showing it in a web, if you're building a website and you want these images up in the website, and you really do want the file size to be smaller and quickly transportable, uploadable, downloadable, that kind of thing. Okay, so I'll say OK. So now I've resized the image for screen. It's gotten smaller. If I press Command 1, I see the actual size of the image. Now I'm going to save it, but I'm going to do Save As. So I go File, Save As, and instead of making it a Photoshop file, which is unnecessary for screen, I'll make it JPEG. So the image is going to be compressed even a little bit further, right? Again, I'll rename it, and I'll say cones wall. And now I like to still leave that file name there, the number 4279, and then I like to annotate what the size of the image is. And I know that it is, it's not even 1080. I've forgotten what it is. Typically I have 1080, but I'm just going to put it in here so that I know it's a smaller image. I would add my tags, urban, Brooklyn, and so on. So I guess I should do that. Brooklyn, walls, third Ave, urban, and so on. Right? So it gets saved in the same folder as a JPEG. Okay? And I just noticed this is a problem. Embed color profile, Adobe RGB. Okay, that needs to be switched at some point to sRGB. I'm going to leave it for right now. So I go Save. Okay. I leave it at 12. Somewhere between 10 and 12 is fine. If you want to see what is actually happening to the image, you can check Preview and see, well, how low does the quality go if I switch this from 12 down to 9. I don't worry about that too much, so I go like that. Okay, now that smaller file has been saved out in that folder. Okay, let me check this size again. Okay, so now in that folder, back here in Bridge, I could find it. I kind of don't want to do it too much, but I'll find the web or the screen version, the print version. Let me scale these down a little bit. Right. So here's Cone's wall for print, right? And there'll also be Cone's wall for 1080 pixels that I just saved, right? Okay, so get those. Okay, so far I have saved two versions of this image, one for an 11 by 17 inch print, one for just screen viewing. Why do you want just screen viewing? Well, who knows, you're creating a portfolio that gets sent out to a client or potential client, you're submitting images for a curator to look at, that kind of thing. And then you've got this other option of save for web, and I don't know why, but Adobe has been trying to weed that out a bit, so they call it legacy sometimes. But save for web optimizes your image for a website. What does that mean that it's being optimized? Well, the web only represents fewer colors than a high-end printer, for example. Right? So you could have millions of colors in a print, and less than that gets represented in the web. And the whole idea when you're making a website is that you're trying to make the file size smaller, tune it to web space. And whenever you upload your photographs to Facebook, Instagram, and so on, they've got computers running in the background that do this for you. So you kind of don't have to worry about it. You don't upload PSD files that are very large, but if you upload a screen file, the algorithm in Facebook is going to convert the colors to the nearest representable color in web space, and so on. But if you're building a website from scratch yourself, right, you need to optimize the image. So here's how you do that. I'll go up here and say File. Now I'll go Save As. Let's double check that. Yeah, that's wrong. Right? That's you used to be able to do that. Let me cancel that out. You have to go File, Export, okay, and it says Save for Web. And notice it says Legacy after that. Again, I don't know what the argument is with getting rid of it, but I use it all the time. In fact, I know this keystroke very well because I use it all the time, which is Command Option Shift S, kind of complicated keystroke. So I go Save for Web. Okay, Save for Web. I want it to be a JPEG. There are other possibilities here, but JPEG is the correct file format for photographs. Okay, so I have JPEG. I can establish what the quality is, right? So here's the original. Here's what it looks like when the quality has been reduced down to 67. Okay? It doesn't have to be at 100%. Your goal here is to make this image small file size and yet look good. All right. One thing I'm noticing here is a big deal. I have it convert to sRGB. And in here, I don't know if you noticed this, but the top image, which is the original, has a different color than the bottom image, right? And I don't like that. I want to know what this image is going to look like on the web. So I'm going to cancel out of that. Okay, I want to change this into sRGB color space, right? And I would do that in the raw converter, but I just know that I didn't before, and you should know this, converting it color space. I'm going to go to Edit, Convert Profile, and you'll see that the source is Adobe RGB, which is for print. Okay. Destination, I'm going to convert it to RGB, sRGB. Okay. And again, these are all different kinds of profiles for different outputs, different screens, different cameras, different printers. Don't concern yourself with that. We're just talking about Adobe RGB and sRGB. So I'm going to convert the colors in this image to sRGB color space. Okay. I'll just say OK. Okay. It takes a second for it to do that. So what it does is maintain the colors as they are, but converts them into the sRGB format. Right? Now, when I go back to my Save for Web, which is Command Option Shift S, or go up to files, export, save for web. Now the colors are closer together than they were previously. In the previous version, where the top original image was in Adobe RGB, the bottom was in sRGB, there was a color shift happening there. Okay, so again, here I can say I want it to be JPEG. Here I can say what the image quality is. It's already in sRGB, but I leave that checked. And if I need to change the size of the image, let's say I was outputting this image from a website that I'm building, and it only needs to be 400 pixels wide or 250 pixels wide, I can change that here, down where it says image size. Okay, over on the left, this is telling me the quality of the image, it's telling me the size of the image, it's telling me the file format, it's a JPEG. It approximates what the download time is, right, at 2 seconds at 2 megabytes per second, right? It's only 246 kilobytes. Okay, for web design, your goal is to make small file sizes. It used to be that you wanted your images, photographs, under 100 megabytes, under 100 kilobytes, right? But let's face it, things are faster these days. You can probably get away with 246. But if I were to make the image smaller, the file size would get smaller, and so on. Okay, so now I'm going to say save. Okay, and save for web. When you get to this point, it'll pull up the folder that you last saved an image to through this process. So you want to be careful about where this image is going. Okay, it just so happens that the last thing I saved for web was the very same folder that this image is coming out of. But if you don't look at that and you aren't aware of where this is going to get saved, you'll lose the image and be like, where I just saved that thing, where'd it go? Okay, once again, I give it a consistent name, Bones Wall, and this time over here, I add web. So I know it's been saved for web. I give it all the regular tags that I've just gone over a bunch of times, Brooklyn, walls, urban, that kind of thing, right? And then I save it, like that. Okay. So now I've got a print version, I've got a regular screen version, and I have a save for web, or a web version. Okay, let's look at the print size. Here's my 11 by 17 inch print. Okay, over in the preview it tells me that's 84 megabytes. Oh, it always kind of blows me away. 84 megabytes, 11 by 17 inch print, right? And that file, that raw file, would make something that's even bigger than that. It would make a 20 inch wide print. Okay, here's what the web image looks like. Click on the web. Oh man, it's 247 kilobytes, right? That is 1/4 of a megabyte. Right? Okay, so web images are much smaller than screen images, like kind of generic screen images, and much smaller than print images. Okay, and if I try to take that web image and make a print from it, it's going to look pixelated, unless it's a tiny, tiny little thumbnail. Right? Okay, so that's saving your files for different outputs. Right? Print, high-end resolution print, screen resolution for sharing with folks, and web resolution for website design. Okay, thanks.